If Bran Stark never became the three-eyed raven, the course of Game of Thrones and the fate of Westeros would be drastically different. The wind howled through the weirwood trees as the small band of travelers trudged forward, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Meera Reed tightened her grip on the sledge, pulling Bran Stark over the ice-covered ground. Every step was agony. Exhaustion clawed at her, but she had come too far to stop now. They had escaped the cave of the three-eyed raven before the Night King's army had reached them, and for a fleeting moment, Meera thought they had survived against all odds. But something was missing. They had left too soon. Bran had never fully learned to control his visions. He was supposed to inherit the knowledge of the three-eyed raven, but the old man had been struck down before he could complete Bran's training. Now, Bran lay shivering on the sledge, his eyes darting wildly beneath his eyelids, lost in fragmented visions he couldn't control. "We need to move faster," she urged. "They're coming." Cold hands clenched the sledge, but Bran's lips barely moved. No, it wasn't supposed to happen this way. Meera ignored his whispers and forced herself forward. If they could reach Castle Black, maybe Jon Snow could help them, if he was even still alive. Unknown to them, the true war had already begun, and Westeros was no longer prepared. Meera Reed pushed through the blizzard, her body numb from exhaustion and cold. Each breath was a struggle, her lungs burning as she dragged Bran's sledge over the frozen ground. The wind screamed around them, a chilling reminder that death was never far behind. Bran groaned softly, his body twitching as his mind wandered in and out of broken visions. Without the full training of the three-eyed raven, his glimpses into the past and future were fragmented, overwhelming. He saw flashes of things he didn't understand, shadowy figures, an iron throne wreathed in fire, a direwolf howling at the moon. None of it made sense. Suddenly a hand gripped Meera's shoulder. She spun around, dagger in hand, ready to fight. Only to see Benjen Stark staring back at her, his face half dead but filled with urgency. "You left too soon," he said. His voice was hoarse, weighed down by something she couldn't place. "There was no choice," Meera snapped. "The dead were coming." Benjen nodded. "And now they come faster." Bran stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Uncle?" His voice was weak, uncertain. "You were meant to be something greater, Bran," Benjen said. "Without the three-eyed raven's full knowledge, we are blind. We have no defense against the Night King's plan." Meera's grip on her dagger tightened. "Then tell us what to do. We can still fight." Benjen shook his head. "Without Bran's full power, Westeros is doomed." Bran felt a deep pit form in his stomach. The war against the Night King wasn't just a battle of swords and fire. It was a battle of knowledge. The past, the present, and the future were meant to intertwine through him. But he was broken, and the dead were still coming. Meera's hands trembled as she gripped Bran's sledge tighter. Benjen's words echoed in her mind. Westeros is doomed. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that they had done everything they could. But deep down she knew he was right. Bran was supposed to become something more. Without the full knowledge of the three-eyed raven, they were stumbling in the dark, blind to the true dangers ahead. Bran's head lolled to the side. His lips were cracked, his breath shallow. He was still trapped in his visions, but now there was something different. His fingers twitched, his face contorted with emotion. I see things I shouldn't," he whispered. His voice was distant, detached, as if he were speaking from another world. Meera bent down. "Bran, what do you see?" His pale eyes flickered. Fire and ice. A battle not yet fought. A king not yet crowned. Benjen knelt beside him, his cold, undead presence making the air even more unbearable. "Tell me, Bran, What do you see of the Night King? Bran's breath hitched. He's not coming for me anymore. Mira stiffened. What do you mean? Bran clenched his jaw, his eyes clouded over again. His mind drifted through the currents of time, seeing images, but not fully understanding them. He had always assumed the Night King was after him because he was the three-eyed raven. But now, without that knowledge, the Night King's focus had shifted. He's going south, Bran whispered. He's already moving. He doesn't need to come for me. He knows we have no plan. Mira's heart pounded. If Bran was no longer the target, then that meant the Night King is skipping Winterfell, Benjen muttered. He's going straight to King's Landing. A silence heavier than the storm settled over them. The Night King, the White Walkers, the entire army of the dead, marching southward. Not to Winterfell, not for a final battle in the north, but to wipe out the capital itself. Mira looked at Bran, fear flashing in her eyes. Then we have to warn them. Benjen shook his head. Even if you do, what difference will it make? The living are unprepared. They don't understand what's coming. Bran swallowed hard. Then we make them understand. The last hope of Westeros was slipping away, and only a crippled boy with half-finished visions could stop it. But would anyone listen? The wind howled through the frozen lands as Mira pushed Bran's sledge forward with renewed urgency. The truth weighed heavily on them. The Night King wasn't coming for Winterfell. He was marching south, straight for King's Landing. They reached Castle Black by nightfall, their bodies numb with exhaustion. The gates groaned open, revealing a grim-faced Edison Tollett. He eyed the half-dead Benjen Stark warily but said nothing. His gaze lingered on Bran. We need to get to Winterfell, Mira blurted out. The Night King, he isn't coming here. He's bypassing the north. He's going straight for the capital. Ed frowned. How do you know this? Bran exhaled weakly. I saw it. Ed hesitated, glancing at his men. The Night's Watch had heard enough talk of visions and prophecies. Too many fools had claimed to know the future, but this was Bran Stark, the boy who had been lost beyond the wall for years. If he had returned now, it had to mean something. We'll get word to Winterfell, Ed said. Jon Snow needs to know. Mira shook her head. Jon isn't at Winterfell. He's in the south dealing with Daenerys Targaryen. Ed ran a hand down his face. Then who rules Winterfell? Sansa, Bran murmured. She won't ignore the warning. Ed gave a sharp nod and ordered a raven to be sent immediately. But Bran wasn't convinced it would be enough. Sansa would listen, but the lords of the realm, they would not believe in visions, in whispered warnings of doom. And in the south, Cersei Lannister would certainly do nothing to stop it. The hall was quiet as Sansa read the raven's message. Arya stood beside her, arms crossed, studying her sister's expression. This is from Bran, Sansa said slowly. Arya frowned. Bran? I thought he wasn't sending messages anymore. Sansa shook her head. Something's changed. He says the Night King isn't coming here. He's marching straight for King's Landing. Arya's face darkened. Cersei won't believe it. No, Sansa agreed. She won't. What do we do? Arya asked. Sansa let out a breath. If the White Walkers take King's Landing, it won't just be the south that falls. The dead will swell their numbers. Westeros will be lost. Arya's eyes gleamed. Then we have to make them listen. Sansa met her sister's gaze and nodded. The game had changed. The Great War would not be fought in the north, but in the heart of Westeros, and they were running out of time. The Raven's warning had been sent. But the lords of Westeros were slow to act. In Winterfell, Sansa Stark paced the great hall, her mind racing. The northern lords had gathered, their expressions grim, but their responses were filled with doubt. "The dead bypassing Winterfell?" Lord Glover scoffed. "And marching straight to King's Landing? Why should we believe this?" "Because Bran saw it," Sansa said firmly. "His visions have never been wrong. And yet we're supposed to abandon our defenses, to march south for a city that never cared for us," Lord Manderly countered. "Let the Lannisters burn." Sansa clenched her jaw. "If King's Landing falls, it won't stop there. The Night King will raise every single man, woman, and child in that city. We'll be outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Arya, who had been silent until now, spoke coldly. "You all sit here arguing while death marches forward." She turned her gaze toward Glover. "You hid from the Battle of the Bastards. Will you hide again until there's nowhere left to run?" The insult landed hard, but the stubborn northern lords weren't so easily swayed. "We are already weakened from the last war," Lord Serwyn muttered. "Jon Snow took our best warriors beyond the wall. We do not have the strength to fight another battle so soon." Sansa's fingers curled into fists. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected so much cowardice. "If Jon were here, he's not," Sansa cut in sharply. "And I am." Silence fell over the room. After a long pause, it was Lord Manderly who spoke first. "Then, tell us, Lady Stark, what is your plan?" Sansa took a slow breath. "We send word to Daenerys Targaryen. She has dragons. She has an army. She must act before it's too late." The northern lords exchanged uneasy glances. "And if she doesn't?" Sansa's expression darkened. "Then we march anyway. Even if we die trying, we must stop the Night King before he reaches the heart of Westeros." Daenerys sat by the roaring fire, rereading the Raven's message from Winterfell. Beside her, Tyrion Lannister rubbed his temple. "This changes everything," he murmured. Jon Snow stood by the window, his face unreadable. "Bran wouldn't lie. If he says the dead are going to King's Landing, then they are." Daenerys set the message down. "And yet Cersei will never believe it," Tyrion exhaled. "My sister believes only in power. Even if she did believe it, she wouldn't care. She would sit on her throne and let the world burn around her." Jon clenched his fists. "Then we make her care." Tyrion's eyes flickered with thought. "If we march on King's Landing, we may force Cersei to act. If she believes we're coming for her, she'll have no choice but to fight." Daenerys nodded slowly. "And if she still refuses?" Jon turned to face her, his expression hard. "Then we deal with the dead ourselves." The Great War was no longer a battle between men. It was a race against time, and time was running out. The air in Dragonstone was thick with tension. Jon Snow stood by Daenerys Targaryen's side as they prepared for war. Not against Cersei, not against the petty rivalries of men, but against the dead who now marched toward King's Landing. "We cannot wait any longer," Jon declared. "If the Night King reaches the city, millions will die. We have to stop him before that happens." Daenerys, her face set with determination, turned to Tyrion. "Send the Raven. Inform the lords of Westeros that we march at dawn." Tyrion hesitated. "And what of Cersei?" Daenerys exhaled sharply. "If she still refuses to act, then she'll burn alongside the dead." Jon cast her a wary glance. He had seen that fire in her eyes before, the same fire that burned beyond reason, the same fire that had scorched the Tarleys alive. But there was no time for doubt now. The fate of Westeros depended on them reaching King's Landing before the Night King did. King's Landing in the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister stood atop the battlements, her hands gripping the cold stone. Below, her city moved as if nothing was amiss. Merchants peddled their wares, children ran through the streets, and the people whispered about dragons and war. She turned to Qyburn. "How long until Daenerys arrives?" Qyburn hesitated. "A matter of days, Your Grace." Cersei smirked. "And the dead?" Qyburn swallowed. "We have yet to confirm their movements, but if the reports from the north are true, they are coming." Cersei's eyes darkened. "Good." Qyburn frowned. "Good?" Cersei turned to face him fully. "Let the dead come. Let them tear through Daenerys and her northern fools. The more they kill, the weaker both sides become. But Your Grace?" Cersei held up a hand. "I do not fear the dead, Qyburn. I fear only losing. And I will not lose." Qyburn bowed his head, but there was doubt in his eyes. He had seen many things, dark experiments, the horrors of war, but never had he seen such arrogance in the face of annihilation. Cersei truly believed she could outlast the storm, but the storm was already here. The walls of King's Landing loomed in the distance, their red stone barely visible through the thick mist rolling in from the north. The cold came first, unnatural, suffocating. Then came the silence, and then the dead. The Night King stood, atop his undead dragon, Viserion, his icy gaze fixed upon the city. Behind him an endless sea of white stretched to the horizon. This was not a battle. This was a slaughter waiting to begin. The Golden Company, Cersei's last line of defense, stood at the gates, their swords drawn. They had fought many wars, but nothing had prepared them for this. Viserion let out a chilling screech before unleashing a torrent of blue flame, reducing the front gates to ash. The dead poured in. King's Landing had been built by men, for men. It had no defense against death itself. The fall had begun. Screams filled the streets of King's Landing as the dead surged through the shattered gates. The Golden Company barely had time to react before they were overwhelmed. Their shining armor, nothing against the relentless assault of whites clawing and biting at their flesh. From the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister stood motionless, her fingers gripping the balcony railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Below her, chaos reigned. The dead swept through Flea Bottom, tearing through the helpless masses. Fire spread, but it did little against the cold of the Night King's army. Qyburn stumbled into the room, his face pale with terror. "Your Grace, we must leave." Cersei did not move. Her golden crown gleamed under the torchlight, but there was no victory here. "No," she whispered, her voice hollow. "This is my city." Qyburn's eyes darted to the door as if he expected the dead to break through at any moment. "Your Grace, please." A hand wrapped around his throat. Qyburn gasped as the mountain lifted him effortlessly off the ground. The Queen hadn't given the order, but it didn't matter. Ser Gregor had no will of his own. With a sickening crunch, Qyburn's skull caved in and his lifeless body hit the floor. Cersei barely reacted. The screams outside grew louder. The dead had reached the Red Keep. Above the burning city, Drogon and Rhaegal soared through the sky, their massive wings casting shadows over the carnage below. Daenerys Targaryen's heart pounded as she took in the sight of her supposed prize, King's Landing already in ruins. Jon Snow rode beside her, gripping Rhaegal's saddle tightly. His face was grim. "We're too late." Below them, the Tau. Streets of King's Landing were flooded with whites. Civilians ran in every direction, but there was nowhere to hide. The Night King's forces had already reached the Red Keep, their icy breath snuffing out the last flickers of resistance. Tyrion, watching from a ship in Blackwater Bay, could barely breathe. His home, his city, was dying before his eyes. He turned to Davos Seaworth, who stood beside him. "We should never have waited," Tyrion muttered. Davos clenched his jaw. "And what could we have done? Fight both Cersei and the dead?" Tyrion had no answer. The mistake had already been made. From above, Daenerys let out a furious cry. "Burn them all!" Jon turned sharply to her. "No, the living are still down." "There." Daenerys hesitated, but only for a moment. Then she gave the command. Drogon opened his maw, releasing a torrent of fire upon the streets below. But it was not enough. For the first time, dragonfire did not bring victory. The Night King had come prepared. From atop his undead dragon, the Night King raised one hand. The whites stopped their slaughter and turned toward the sky. A haunting silence filled the city. Then, Viserion took flight. The battle that had been meant for Winterfell now played out in the skies above King's Landing. Daenerys urged Drogon higher, avoiding the cold blast of blue fire that streaked past her. Jon maneuvered Rhaegal to strike, but the Night King was relentless. Then, without warning, Rhaegal let out a terrible screech. Jon barely had time to react before an icy spear struck the dragon's chest. Rhaegal convulsed in midair, his wings folding as he plummeted to the streets below. Jon leaped from the saddle just before impact, landing hard on the rooftop of a crumbling building. He groaned in pain but forced himself up. Rhaegal lay broken beneath him, his green eyes fading into nothingness. Daenerys screamed in fury, "Drogon, kill him!" Drogon lunged at the Night King, his fiery breath engulfing him. But as the flames cleared, the Night King remained untouched. He lifted his spear and threw it. The world seemed to slow as the jagged ice spear hurtled toward Drogon. Daenerys barely had time to react before the weapon struck. Drogon roared in agony as the spear pierced deep into his side. He twisted violently in the air, throwing Daenerys from his back. She tumbled through the sky. Jon watched in horror as she fell. And then, the Night King descended upon the Red Keep. Inside the throne room, Cersei stood alone. The sounds of battle raged outside, but she no longer cared. Her golden crown felt heavier than ever. The doors burst open. For a moment, she thought it was Daenerys. But it wasn't. The Night King stepped forward, his icy gaze locking onto hers. Cersei, Lannister, Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, let out a breathless laugh. "So this is how it ends." The Night King raised his hand, and Cersei felt the cold take her. King's Landing belonged to the dead. Jon staggered through the ruins, his heart pounding. He had lost Rhaegal. He had lost Daenerys. But he hadn't lost hope. Somewhere in the distance, Arya moved through the shadows. She had seen the Night King enter the Red Keep. She knew what had to be done. The same way she had ended the war at Winterfell, she would end this one. Jon found her near the ruins of the throne room. "Arya," she shook her head. "There's no time." Together they made their way through the wreckage, past the bodies, past the dead. The Red Keep was collapsing, but they had one last chance. One last hope. The Night King had taken everything, but he had not won. Not yet. The Red Keep lay in ruins. Smoke and frost clashed in the air, the remnants of dragonfire and the creeping death that had consumed the city. The wails of the dying had faded into silence, replaced by the soft crunch of ice as the dead patrolled the broken streets of King's Landing. Jon Snow gripped his sword tighter as he and Arya moved through the wreckage. The throne room was ahead, its once majestic doors shattered by the Night King's arrival. Inside, the fate of Westeros would be decided. Arya turned to him, her face streaked with ash. "He won't fall easily." Jon nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I know." They stepped inside. The Iron Throne was barely recognizable, half buried beneath rubble. The Night King stood before it, his piercing blue eyes reflecting the ruin around him. And at his feet lay Cersei Lannister's frozen corpse, her golden crown still glinting in the dim torchlight. The dead had conquered the South, and the Night King had come to claim his throne. Jon didn't hesitate. He charged, Longclaw raised, fury burning in his veins. He swung with all his might, only for the Night King to catch the blade midair. The cold shot through Jon's body like a knife. He gasped as the Night King shoved him back effortlessly. Jon hit the ground hard, his sword clattering beside him. Arya darted forward, her dagger flashing toward the Night King's neck. But this time, he was ready. Faster than she could react. The Night King spun, catching her wrist. Ice spread up her arm and Arya let out a choked cry as the cold began to consume her. Jon forced himself up, eyes wide with horror. "No!" The Night King's grip tightened. Arya struggled, but the life was draining from her. Jon grabbed Longclaw and threw himself at the Night King once more, but the ancient being merely stepped aside, knocking him to the ground once more. For the first time, Jon felt true despair. They had come so far. They had sacrificed everything, and yet it was not enough. A sound echoed through the ruined throne room, the beating of massive wings. Jon turned his head, barely able to comprehend what he was seeing. Drogon. The great dragon had returned, his body scarred, his eyes burning with rage. With a deafening roar, Drogon unleashed a torrent of fire upon the Night King. The flames engulfed the room, swirling around the icy figure standing at the throne. The heat was unbearable. The entire Red Keep shook as Drogon poured everything he had left into this final attack. And when the fire finally faded, the Night King still stood. Jon's heart sank. Drogon let out a low, mournful growl, as if even he knew this was the end. But then, Arya moved. She was weak, her body trembling from the cold, but her free hand gripped her Valyrian steel dagger. The Night King turned to her just in time to see the blade plunging toward his chest. For the first time, the Night King reacted. His hand shot out to stop her, catching her wrist again. But this time Arya was ready. She dropped the dagger. It fell, right, into her waiting other hand. With a swift final motion, she drove the blade deep into the Night King's chest. The sound of ice cracking filled the room. The Night King's piercing blue eyes widened. For the first time in thousands of years, the Lord of the Dead faltered. His fingers twitched, his grip on Arya loosening. Then, with a final shuddering breath, he shattered. A great icy explosion rippled through the Red Keep as the Night King's body burst into shards, his lifeless remains scattering across the gay throne room floor. Outside, the whites collapsed where they stood, their hollow eyes fading into nothingness. The dead no longer walked. The war was over. Jon scrambled to Arya's side. She was alive, but barely, her skin still tainted by the Night King's deadly frost. He pulled her into his arms. "You did it." Arya let out a weak, breathless laugh. "Told you I would." Drogon loomed over them, his massive wings casting a shadow over the ruins of King's Landing. The city was broken, its people either dead or scattered. There was no victory here, only survival. Tyrion arrived moments later, his face pale as he took in the destruction. His home was gone, his queen was gone, and yet he had never felt so relieved. Daenerys was found among the wreckage. She had survived, her fall, though barely. As Jon helped her to her feet, She looked around at what was left of the capital she had once sought to rule. There was nothing left to rule. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Daenerys turned to Jon. "What now?" Jon looked at the ruins, at the bodies, at the empty Iron Throne. He had spent so long fighting, but now, standing here at the end of all things, he realized something. "There's nothing left to fight for," he murmured. The Iron Throne, once the symbol of ultimate power, now lay buried beneath rubble and ash. Perhaps that was how it was always meant to be. Weeks passed. The survivors of King's Landing made their way north, to Winterfell, to safety. There was no longer a single ruler of Westeros. Instead, the surviving lords and ladies of the realm gathered to rebuild, to create something new from the ashes of the old world. Daenerys, seeing that there was no throne left to claim, made the decision to leave Westeros behind. She boarded a ship and set sail for Essos, with what remained of her loyal followers. Jon Snow, having fought and bled for a world that no longer needed him, returned to the north. He did not take a crown. He did not seek power. He simply disappeared beyond the wall, finding solace among the free folk. Arya Stark, the girl who had killed death itself, ventured west, beyond the known world, searching for something beyond war and vengeance. Sansa Stark became the true power in Westeros. She ruled the north with wisdom, rebuilding Winterfell and forging alliances that would last beyond the bloodshed. Tyrion Lannister, the last of his house, became the quiet voice of reason among the new leaders of Westeros, ensuring that no one ever forgot the cost of war. And so the world changed. The Iron Throne was no more. The cycle of war and conquest had ended. Westeros had no king, no queen, no ruler to dictate its fate. Instead, it had survivors. And sometimes, that was enough.